We are very, very, very pleased to be talking to Noam Chomsky. He is professor of linguistics at MIT, author of over 30 books. Well, I think everybody knows him. It's odd to go through this whole intro, but what the heck. And his latest book is called Hegemony. Hegemony. I used to think it was Hegemony, I'm embarrassed to say. But I also thought the Greek was fatigue when I was younger. Hegemony. Hell, now I can't say it. Hegemony or survival. America's quest for global dominance. Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us here on the Majority Report.
Hi, and don't be embarrassed about not knowing how to pronounce it. It depends what country you're in.
Where do they say hegemony?
England, they pronounce it hegemony or something.
Well, I'm a bit of an Anglophile, so I'll just continue to do that. But how do they say fatigue? They don't say fatigue, do they?
Not usually, yeah.
Yeah, so that one I have to own is not very bright. But I wanted to, if you don't mind, I wanted to begin by asking you about the national security strategy of the United States of America, because I've heard you speak very eloquently about it. I think some people think that it sounds great. If you're not really much of a critical thinker and you don't understand what the national security strategy of the United States of America means domestically and internationally, who's behind it and what their angle is. Mm-hmm. So can you give people who might not be up to speed on that your take on it?
This was the declaration in September 2002, timed right before the midterm elections and coinciding with the virtual announcement of the invasion of Iraq, which was supposed to be the first implementation of it. The declaration said pretty straightforwardly that the United States intends to dominate the world indefinitely, by force if necessary. That's the dimension in which the United States does indeed reign supreme, and to destroy any potential challenge to this domination. So if any potential challenge is perceived, it will be attacked. That's the essence of the national security strategy. It was understood very clearly at once. The main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs of the Council on Foreign Relations, had an article about it within a few weeks, in fact, describing it as their words, a new imperial grand strategy, and criticizing it not so much in principle, but more in style, and arguing that it would cause damage to the United States and to the world. It was a serious threat because of the way it was, the brazen, aggressive way in which it was formulated and the way it was going to be implemented. And others pretty much agreed. So, for example, Henry Kissinger described it as what he called a revolutionary new doctrine.
He's not really the best guy to endorse things, though, is he?
Well, it was
would you Kissinger maybe isn't the guy you want endorsing it?
No, I mean, some opposed it. It was very sharply criticized right across the foreign policy elite, but on pretty narrow grounds. Not that it was wrong, but that the style and implementation were dangerous to U.S. interests. In fact, that's the kind of criticism you're hearing today. It was captured rather well by Madeleine Albright, Clinton Secretary of State, in the same journal, Foreign Affairs. She pointed out accurately that every president has a similar doctrine, but they kind of keep it quiet. It's sort of in their back pocket. They use it when it's needed. They don't smash people in the face with it and make it clear that we have utter contempt for even allies, let alone anyone else. And that does cause difficulties. Actually, Kissinger made the same criticism. There were a few people who made a more principled criticism, I should say. One was Arthur Schlesinger, who's maybe the most respected living U.S. historian, former Kennedy advisor. He sharply condemned the implementation of it, more so than anyone else I read. As the bombs began to fall on Baghdad, he wrote an article in the Los Angeles Times in which he recalled President Roosevelt's words when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on what Roosevelt called a date that will live in infamy. And Schlesinger said, today it is we Americans who live in infamy as the Bush administration follows the policies of Imperial Japan. And he also predicted accurately that he pointed out that the Bush administration within about a year or two had succeeded in converting a global wave of sympathy for the United States into a global wave of fear and hatred of American aggressiveness and militancy, and predicted that this would get worse, as indeed it did. So there were criticisms. And so going back to Albright, she pointed out, she knew certainly that Clinton had a similar doctrine. In fact, she herself had reiterated it as a UN ambassador under Clinton. She had repeated Clinton's words to the United Nations that the United States would use force, as she put it, multilaterally when we can, and unilaterally if we must. In fact, the Clinton administration had informed Congress in its regular messages that the U.S. policy was to use force if necessary to guarantee access to markets and resources. I mean, taken literally, that goes beyond the national security strategy. But the point is, it was quiet, reserved, in the back pocket, not put forth in such a way as to ensure that even allies would be bitterly offended by it, and that the U.S. would be utterly isolated in its attempts to carry out this policy of brazen imperialism. And that difference is a significant difference.
Do you think it was just a matter that in the Clinton administration there was no real opportunity to exercise this doctrine?
They exercised it. They did. In fact, for example, the bombing of Sudan and Afghanistan without any real text, that essentially created Al-Qaeda and put bin Laden on the map. The U.S. intelligence records up until that point, there was barely any, I don't think there was any mention of Al-Qaeda, or if there was, it was marginal. And bin Laden was regarded as some sort of small-time financier. But the bombing of these two countries it led to a sharp increase in recruitment and financing for Al-Qaeda, and turned bin Laden into a major symbol. Also established close relations between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Previously had been jihad. That's an implementation of the strategy. And there were others, bombing of Serbia, for example. But it was done in a way which kind of brought in some measure of international support, instead of being carried out as a kind of a flat statement that we don't care what you think. I remember what happened in 2002. Right after the formulation of the national security strategy, the Bush administration went to the United Nations and told them, you can be relevant, that's the word that was used, if you endorse what we're going to do anyway, and otherwise you can be a debating society, as Colin Powell put it. Well, that's bound to cause hostility and anger, and of course it did.
But is that the point? Is that the point to practice the politics of extreme belligerence? It seems to me that the sort of arm of this government, the Wolfowitz, Feith, Pearl, Rumsfeld types, sort of, and David Frum when he was involved, sort of like to practice this belligerence and antagonize to get things done.
Yeah, they're basically street fighters. They say, we don't care what you think. We're arrogant, powerful. We'll do what we want, and you can come along with us, or you can, we'll kick you in the face. And that's the basis on which the doctrine and its implementation were largely criticized. It was, the criticism with the foreign policy elite was completely unprecedented, and the hostility around the world among elites was unprecedented. So, for example, when Colin Powell went to the World Economic Forum, basically the people who own the world, the hostility was so extreme they barely allowed him to speak. But it wasn't so much the doctrine. The doctrine is familiar. It's the way it was presented, implemented, and the style. And those are not insignificant facts. That's part of the reason why the U.S. is so isolated and by now so hated and feared in the world.
So it's not simply that, so as opposed to the usual prescription of bullying and unilateralism, we have a bullying and unilateralism that has sort of a tacky swagger.
That's also very incompetent. I mean, what they have done in Iraq is beyond belief. I mean, seasoned veteran correspondents who've been all sorts of, every war zone around have pointed out that this is, must be one of the worst failures in history.
No, we have to take a break right now. When we get back, I'd like to discuss embedded journalists with you a little bit, if that's okay. We are here on the Majority Report. I'm Janeane Garofalo with Sam Seder. On the phone, we have Noam Chomsky, and we will be right back. Well, I'm here with Sam Seder. On the phone, we have Noam Chomsky, whose latest book is called Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance. Noam, before we get into the embedded reporters in Iraq, I wanted to ask, this came from our producer, this question. Do you believe that the majority of Americans support this belligerent stance of the security strategy or this antagonistic behavior towards the rest of the world and our allies?
I doubt it. Not those who understand it. I mean, a lot of Americans are frightened. It's an interesting fact, and it goes far back. But there's a large percentage of the population that actually believes that Iraq was responsible for 9/11, that it was planning future terrorist attacks, that it had programs for developing weapons of mass destruction, that ties to terrorism. A large part of the country even believes that the rest of the world supported us invasion. The level of misimpressions, just beliefs that no one holds in the world is quite striking. It's an interesting commentary on the U.S. media. Actually, there have been careful cases that trace these incredible beliefs back to the news sources on which they're based.
Fox News being one. But I want to, here's another question that sort of piggybacks on that. When I would make the rounds on some of these news stations prior to the invasion and occupation of Iraq as an anti-war voice, it occurred to me that a lot of these people who were interviewing me or who worked at these stations didn't seem much brighter than the average Joe around the water cooler who didn't know what was going on. And there were some who, I don't know which is worse, some knew what was going on and they misrepresented, and then some don't even know what's going on. They just are basically stenographers for the White House.
Yeah, that's basically correct.
So don't you think there'd be standards of how people get hired?
No, not really. In fact, I don't. To tell you the honest truth, over time, over a long period, I don't want to talk about this particular incident, I think by and large, educated people tend to be the most indoctrinated. So take, say, the Vietnam War, which we can look back at with a little perspective, and attitudes have been studied quite carefully. Among the general population of the country, by about 1969, roughly 70% regarded the war as, the words of the polls are, fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake, which is correct. But among educated sectors, virtually no one did. You don't find that view articulated except way out at the margins. At most, it was regarded as a mistake, or too costly or something. In this case, and those attitudes among the general public persisted right up to the most recent polls a couple of years ago, even though they get no support from articulate opinion. And it's not the only case. I mean, it's often true that the public attitudes have a much more realistic picture of the way the world works than educated, articulate elites, which I don't think is very surprising. I mean, it's the educated, articulate elites who are both victims of propaganda and the propagators of it, not just in the United States. I think this is common elsewhere, too.
And do you think that they're more susceptible to propaganda because they aren't necessarily bearing the brunt of...
Well, they are the ideological the doctrinal managers. And there's a tendency, I don't want to say it's uniform or anything, and it's not specific to the United States, but there's a tendency for those who we regard as intellectuals to be more subordinated to the doctrinal systems which they themselves propagate.
You know what, actually, Noam, I've heard this discussed before, but here's where I differ on that. I think that there's some educated, quote-unquote, elites who, yes, they may be indoctrinated, but not because they're buying into it. I think that there is a sort of a little spark inside them of the Darwinist, or of the survival of the fittest, Herbert Spencer type of guy or gal. And I think it comes more from a mean-spiritedness or a national... I can't explain... I'm not articulating it correctly. But I think there's a cruelty. Not that they don't understand what they're saying. They are misrepresenting themselves deliberately.
Deliberately in order to control and dominate.
Yes.
There's an element of... it's pretty... you can't really quantify it, and these are subjective impressions, but I think what you say there's an element of truth to it. On the other hand, I also think, and this is just from many years of half a century of direct experience and reading, that they tend to be indoctrinated. And I think it's true of other countries. It's an interesting thing when you read the declassified records, archival materials, where people are just talking to each other internally. They often talk very much the way they do to the outside. So you look at the released Russian archives. They've been coming out in the last couple of years. You find that the worst gangsters are talking to each other about the need to save the democracies of Eastern Europe from the attacks of the fascists supported by the West. The same kind of stuff that you find in the most vulgar external propaganda. And this is pretty common. There was, for example, just a study done by a good Indonesian historian of recently released Indonesian archives from 1999, during the period when Indonesia was carrying out the final stage of the horrendous atrocities in East Timor, for which the U.S. and Britain were primarily responsible, I should add. But in that year, it turns out that the Indonesian generals, political leaders, and others believed their own propaganda. Internally, they were saying they expected to that the Timorese supported them, that it was just a bunch of terrorists who were opposing them, that they'd easily win the elections, and so on. And I think that's probably generally true. If you looked at Nazi archives, you find the same thing. And you look at internal U.S. records, you find pretty much the same. British records. But I think it might still be a sense of... We have to take a break, but I think it still might be a sense of self-delusion. Yeah. I don't know that you could possibly believe that that's true, that it's just a handful of East Timorese, but that they support you. Whatever it is, whether it's self-delusion or purposeful ignorance, or the phenomenon is quite striking. I think willful ignorance is a phenomenon. We have to take a break. We'll be right back with Noam Chomsky here on The Majority Report.
On Air America Radio Network and a phone, Noam Chomsky, the author of Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, amongst many, many, many other books, and he is a professor of linguistics at MIT. Is that correct? In linguistics.
Yep.
And so, no, I wanted to ask you, the Iraq invasion and occupation is clearly an element of this doctrine of American world domination. From a tactical standpoint, why Iraq?
Oh, that's pretty straightforward. And the Iraqis understand it very well. It's only, this is more willful ignorance on our part. So just to illustrate, there was a recent poll about 6 months ago in Baghdad, by a U.S.-run poll, where they asked the Iraqis why they thought the U.S. had invaded Iraq. Some agreed with the virtually universal opinion of articulate American opinion, namely to establish democracy. 1% of Iraqis thought it was to establish democracy. It's about almost everybody here. 5% said it was to help Iraqis. The rest said what's perfectly obvious, to take over Iraq's resources, use them as a lever of world control, and to reorganize the Middle East from an Iraq base as in U.S. interest. Yeah, that's the reason.
And to what extent does the trading of oil in euros and the need that China is going to have, the increasing need that China is going to have for oil play into this?
It's part of it, but remember, it goes way back. I mean, 50 years ago, George Kennan, who was one of the top U.S. planners, pointed out that control over Middle East oil gives the United States what he called veto power over what other countries can do. And that's a constant strain in U.S. policy right from the 1940s to the present. I mean, it was understood back in the 1940s that Middle East oil is what the State Department called a stupendous source of strategic power. They control it, even though the U.S. didn't use it. I mean, the U.S. was a major producer. But by controlling it, the U.S. was in a position to set bounds on what others could do. And this is a struggle that's going on all the time. I mean, one of the major issues of world domination since the 1940s has been how does the U.S. prevent Europe and more recently Asia from going off in their own direction independently. And one of the ways of doing it is trying to control the tap.
Can I ask you a question? What prevents the White House and their shills in the corporate media from just saying, you know what, it is oil, has a lot to do with it. Do you like your SUVs? Do you like your lifestyle? Well, this is how you stay number one.
Well, see, it really doesn't have to do with access to oil. I mean, the U.S. is going to get the oil anyway, no matter who controls it, because that's the way the oil market works. It's a matter of control, not access. If the U.S. can control the flow of oil, can determine where it goes, what the prices are, and so on, then others have to obey.
So why not say that?
Well, you can't. You don't want to tell the truth about how policy
But
works.
we do have a lot of very coarse and selfish people in this consumer culture who I think would say, yeah, that's right.
But it's not a matter of U.S. use of oil. The U.S. is going to use the oil anyway. I mean, even if Iraq controls it. It's a question of controlling the rest of the world.
No, I understand that. But why then, if we have such an easily misled culture, or we have such a culture of people who are not too concerned with the world outside their borders and are not particularly altruistic, why then could you not say it's about control? It's about controlling the flow.
I mean, I tend to agree with elite policymakers on this. I think the public is more decent than that. That's the reason they lie. They're afraid the public is decent. And I think they're right. I mean, why have propaganda altogether? Why not just tell people the truth? It's easier to tell the truth than to lie. I think the reason governments and other power systems lie to the public is that they believe they are decent, honest human beings and not going to accept the truth. They have to lie to them.
Do you think that the leaders of these countries of this country, of any country that lies to the extent that our country does to its people, do you think that is indicative that we may have reached the limits of democracy in its capacity to control what a nation or state does?
If you look over the past centuries, there was a time when governments could, and it's still true in much of the world, that governments could control their population just by force. You have torture chambers and secret police and so on. As people won more and more freedom in the United States, in many ways more than anywhere else, there have been extensive and very successful, courageous popular struggles that just won a lot of freedom. As that happened, governing elements, powerful elements, began to realize that they can't control people by force anymore. They're going to have to control their opinions and attitudes. That's exactly why I think the huge public relations industry, which is basically a propaganda industry aimed at control of attitudes and opinions, that's why it developed in the most free societies, the United States and Britain. It sort of spread to others, but it began here. And the United States, and secondarily Britain, have been in the forefront of developing modern propaganda. I think primarily because the populations had won sufficient freedom, so you just couldn't control them by force.
No, I have to go back to the point of you saying that you believe that it's because governments feel that people are more decent that they can't tell them the truth. I really find that hard to believe when you think about the level of willful ignorance in this country, the level of aggression, the level of people that accept Abu Ghraib and accept people like the Fox News pundits who and their right-wing radio blowhards who say it's nothing more than fraternity pranks, and they accept that. And I really believe if the government really thought, and all the publicity people they pay, and I know it's a huge it's like Madison Avenue, if they really believed that we were decent, they wouldn't treat us so disrespectfully.
Well, it's a matter of interpretation, but my interpretation is different. I think the reason is, I think Fox News and so on they pander to people's fears. Americans are very afraid. It's a long-standing thing. It goes back to early colonial days. The country has always been very much afraid. Actually, there's a great book, if I can recommend a book, by Bruce Franklin over at Rutgers called War Stars, studying the history of American popular literature.
War Stars?
Yeah, the kind of literature that's read by millions of people, including well-known populist writers like Jack London, who's kind of a leftist. And he finds a long strain way back of fear that we're just about to be destroyed. And it's typically, he points out, we're going to be destroyed by the people who we are crushing. So the early phases, we're going to be destroyed by the Indians. Then we're going to be destroyed by the blacks. Then by the Chinese coolies. I mean, Jack London, who's a socialist, the popular populist, he actually called for the extermination of the entire population of China by bacteriological warfare, because if we don't do it, they're going to overwhelm us. And this goes right up to today with, the movies about, the communists are going to take over and kill us and so on and so forth. There is a long strain of fear in the country to which propagandists can pay. I suspect that if you interviewed these people involved in the torture in Abu Ghraib, you asked them why they're doing it, they would probably say, we're getting revenge for what they did to us. This is deep-seated fears which vote and vicious propagandists can exploit.
Well, then how do you explain the people that torture... I'm sorry, Sam. Sam's dying to ask you questions, too, but, this opportunity to talk to you is so amazing. I can't believe it. I'm sorry that I'm running off the mouth. But how do you explain that? You would say that the people who tortured Abu Ghraib would say it was a fear-based decision. But you're talking about people that were committing these atrocities in an American prison system. Yeah. And they were carted over there. And do they really fear that these people behind bars?
I think so. I think they think that they're subhumans who are going to, who we have to control, they're going to destroy us. This happens to be right back to the Declaration. Take a look at the Declaration of Independence sometime. We all sort of learn it in 8th grade, but, who pays attention? But read it sometimes. This was written by Thomas Jefferson, maybe the most, the peak of intellectual and moral integrity that we can think of. One charge against King George III is that he unleashed against us the merciless Indian savages whose known way of warfare was massacring women and children. Well, the Founding Fathers knew perfectly well that it was the other way around. It was the merciless English colonists whose known way of warfare was to wait until the men left the village and then go in and murder all the women and children and drive them out. They knew perfectly well that they read their own records that they were basically, as they put it, exterminating the native population. But nevertheless, in the Declaration of Independence, they reverse it. It's we're the innocent victims. It's true that there were Indian atrocities, but the major story was the invasion and the elimination of the indigenous population. And that goes right up to the present. Just a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times Book Review, elite journal, one of the leading American historians, a very good historian, referred in passing to the conquest of the national territory, and he said in the course of the conquest, several 100,000 Indians were eliminated. Well, he's off by a factor of 10. It was millions of Indians. And eliminated is a pretty funny word. If you read in a German newspaper today that during the Second World War, several 100,000 Jews were eliminated, you'd think there's a problem in Germany. Well, that appeared in the New York Times Book Review by a highly respectable, liberal, honest. We name our weapons of destruction after victims of genocide. I mean, what are Apache helicopters or Tomahawk missiles? No, these are people who we exterminated. I mean, can you imagine if the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, named its attack helicopters Jew? We'd think it's outlandish. But all of this is internalized somehow, and it's deep in the culture, and it can be exploited by Fox News pretty consciously on their part, I suspect.
All right, we have to take a break. We are talking to Noam Chomsky, author, professor, linguist. You're listening to the Majority Report on Air America Radio. We'll be right back, and I will get to ask a question.
Sorry, Sam, I can't resist.
My name is Sam Sedar. Janeane Garofalo and I are talking to Noam Chomsky, Professor Noam Chomsky, on the phone, author of his latest Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance.
Yeah, I apologize for that.
Yes.
Hegemony.
You had to make it so difficult to pronounce. So I wanted to ask you that if you think it's possible that our media will ever be more objective or more informative. I mean, perhaps you know the better word, what I'm looking for as a linguist. But do you think the media can improve in its current state?
Well, to tell you the honest truth, I think they're better now than they were 40 years ago. Partly because this country's better. It's a more civilized country in a lot of ways as a result of the activism of the 1960s and all the developments that followed. This is over a very broad spectrum. I mean, women's rights, environmental concerns, concern for human rights, opposition to aggression. Suppose it was 40 years ago, and the Fallujah incident had taken place. Just how it would have been dealt with. It would have been dealt with by B-52s and mass murder operations. But the government can't get away with that now. It's not the 60s. The population won't accept it, and the media reflect it. They're part of the society. People who were in them have gone through those experiences, and there's been a kind of a civilizing effect. There are counter tendencies as well. I don't want to appear too optimistic about it, but these are quite real. And I think you get more critical reporting now than you would have, say, in the 60s or the 50s.
And do you think that is a trend that's going to progress into the future, or?
Well, it's up to us. We have a lot of freedom and privilege in this country. We can shape the future, but you have to do it. It's not going to happen by itself.
And in a more specific sense, what's your response to what the New York Times is doing in terms of it's almost we called it a sort of mea culpa.
Well, very weak and evasive. I mean, they avoided the main issues completely. Actually, it's a pretty good and typically acid commentary on it by Alex Coburn that I just really
that's great in the Current Nation magazine. Very good. He called it a kind of culpa.
Yeah, he's quite right.
And does this square with your notion of propaganda in this day and age?
Yeah. I mean, years ago, before the Nazis made the term unpopular, it was just called propaganda. Now it's called different words, but the efforts to shape perceptions, attitudes, and beliefs continue, and it's a huge industry. I mean, what's called marketing, which is mostly propaganda, is probably a couple of $1 trillion a year. These are huge industries.
Well, Madison Avenue, K Street, and Hollywood Boulevard are the same concept. But that's what always kind of blows my mind when you have pundits and corporate media types who love to take Hollywood to task.
Yeah.
It's the same business.
It is. You're right.
So why are we creating a evil empire, if you will, within our borders, which is Hollywood, when you have image makers and marketing teams that manufacture, as you say, manufacture consent among the populace by using the same tricks as Hollywood does?
Yeah, but let me just recall that the phrase manufacturing consent was I borrowed from the dean of American journalism in the 20th century, Walter Lippmann. He said that manufacturing consent is a new technique in the art of democracy. He thought it was a good thing. I mean, dominant elites must manufacture consent among the stupid and ignorant masses. That's the core principle of power systems, ours and others. And yes, they're dedicated to it. And my own opinion, as I said before, is because I think they're afraid of the public. They think if they tell the public the truth, they won't allow these to happen. I'm awfully sorry, but I have to get off. I have another interview coming in a minute.
Oh, my gosh.
And Sam was just about to ask another question. Well, Noam, thank you so much. You have really heard us a great deal, and we're so pleased to have spoken with you here on the Majority Report.
Okay, good talk to you.
Okay, see you soon.
Yep.
Bye.